Good day, ladies and gentlemen. I've been reading a book recently called The Kingship of Christ and Organized Naturalism by Father Dennis Fahey. There's the book right there. Father Fahey's wonderful. Thank you to Father McMahon for getting me to read this book. I've read selections of Fahey in the past, but recently I've started to read him more. He's an author that's been, generally speaking, kind of memory hold in the post-conciliar Catholic milieu. He tends to talk about things you're not supposed to talk about anymore, but had the support of the hierarchy and so forth before the council. Did the faith change after the council? Should we not be talking about things from before the council? Well, these are perennial questions that traditionalists have been asking the whole time. Nonetheless, we're going to talk to you today about something that I read in his book, and really, it's actually from an encyclical by Pope Leo XIII, and it is his encyclical, just half a second here, and it's the encyclical Humanum Genus, which is about Freemasonry. In any event, we're going to talk about Freemasonry today and the Novus Ordo Missae, the new Mass, and what is the relationship. Now, before I continue, although there are many, conspiratorial things, there are, Annibale Bugnini being a Freemason and all these kinds of things which have been essentially beyond a reasonable doubt proven by this point. We're not here to talk about the conspiratorial side of the various shenanigans of the Freemasons. Those things are important. That's just not the focus of our talk today. Instead, we're going to go over how the Novus Ordo liturgy necessarily imbibes the most fundamental aspect of Freemasonry. And it has nothing to do with the boogeyman. And it's important we get to the root of this because sometimes it's sort of like in our lives, we know the devil is real. We know the devil tempts us. We know people get possessed, all these kinds of things. So we kind of tend to look at the demonic through the lens of those sort of demonic parlor tricks. But we forget that the most powerful thing the devil can do is to get us to inflate our pride. The most powerful thing the devil can do is to tempt us towards sin and for us to just simply sin. A person can be afflicted with demonic afflictions their whole life, but if that person doesn't commit mortal sins and they die in a state of grace, that person's a saint. Whereas someone who may never have any encounter with sort of the spookiness of what can happen, and it's real. I've seen it before in my life. It can happen, especially in times of conversion. There's a lot of retaliation that happens from the demons when they seem like they're losing their grip. Nonetheless, we shouldn't be focusing on the sort of parlor tricks, flash in the pan kind of stuff, and instead we should be focusing on the main tactic of the devil, which is to get you to be a heretic, which is to get you to be prideful, which is to get you to sin. That's the thing we focus on. Likewise, when we're talking about the Masonic infiltration in the church, the Freemasons coming in and corrupting things and so forth, we need to get beyond looking for a conspiracy under every rock. The conspiracies are there. They've been unearthed. That's a real thing. The Illuminati were real. That was Adam Weishaupt and his philosophy, Illuminism. There were other groups called the Illuminados, which were also a part of the proliferation of Freemasonry. There were Jewish merchants that sort of spread this thing throughout Spain, especially. That's all very real. That's all very real. But we're going to go to the core of the real danger of Freemasonry and the new Mass in this show. As always, I'm here to make friends. So if this is something that upsets you, thank you for coming by. But please, I would hope that you would stick around and listen to my thoughts on the matter because it's not surfacey stuff. We're going to go to the depth of the philosophy of Freemasonry and why that is imbibed in the new Mass. Before we do, I am going to Italy this fall with Father Albert Kallio, a traditional Dominican who can find one. Well, we did. Once-in-a-lifetime pilgrimage opportunity, thanks to all of those who have signed up. It's looking great. Families are welcome, by the way. Some people have asked me that. Maybe difficult with really little children, but as long as they can keep up and, they're able to have long days and things like that, that's totally up to the parents. And here's a quick promo for that trip.
All the trouble in Rome, it is easy to forget about one unshakable fact. Our church is the Roman Catholic Church, and Rome is the eternal city. What a perfect time to go on a pilgrimage to the eternal city and the other monumental sites of Catholic heritage in beautiful Italy. Join Father Albert Kallio and me this November as we tour through the shrines of Italy and the Amalfi Coast as we attend daily Mass in the Old Rite in the footsteps of St. Peter and St. Francis. Click the link in the description to register for this once-in-a-lifetime pilgrimage to discover the heart of the Catholic faith in the heart of the old Roman Empire.
go to the link in the description below, whether you're watching on YouTube or listening on one of the audio platforms, or you can just go to kennedyhall.ca. That's Kennedy Hall, my name, my last name.ca for Canada. I wanted kennedyhall.com, but it was like $6,000, and kennedyhall.ca was like $50, so I bought that one. kennedyhall.ca/Italy. The information's there. There's this big red button that says click here. Shocker. Click there, and you'll get right to where you need to go. All right, ladies and gentlemen, so this is from a book, as I said, called The Kingship of Christ and Organized Naturalism by Father Fahey. I'm going to talk about lots of stuff in this book as we go, but this was something that struck me as extremely interesting. So here's a quote, and this is from the encyclical Humanum Genus by Leo XIII. And I'm going to put a quote on the screen here that you can read along with me, and so we can go through this together. So here's the quote that I was struck by today, and it really got me thinking. And it is this, and this is from a section in the encyclical called The Meaning of Naturalism. And Leo XIII is pointing out that in Freemasonry, there is this philosophy of naturalism, which is really the most pernicious error, because it's what corrupts the minds and the hearts of the faithful. Again, no one has to join a Freemasonic or a Freemason lodge in order to be damned. They just have to reject the Catholic faith even a little bit. To reject one doctrine is to reject them all, as the saints tell us. Okay, here's the quote. The fundamental doctrine of the naturalists, he's referring to the Masons, is that human nature and human reason must be in all things mistress and guide. This decided, they either ignore man's duties towards God or pervert them, by vague and erroneous opinions. So I'll read that one more time. The fundamental doctrine of the naturalists is that human nature and human reason must be in all things mistress and guide. This decided, they either ignore man's duties towards God or pervert them by vague and erroneous opinions. So let's break this down. So the fundamental doctrine of these naturalists, which is the undergirding philosophy of Masonry and essentially liberalism, they're kind of synonymous in many ways. Masonry is obviously more of the secret society side, but they're liberals philosophically. This is the basis of the American Constitution. It's the basis of the Canadian political ethos as well, maybe not in as explicit ways, but it's definitely there. The fundamental doctrine is that human nature and human reason must be in all things mistress and guide. So your nature and your reason, let's break that down for a second. So if someone believes that your nature, primarily, first thing, and reasons, we'll talk about nature first. If someone believes that your nature must be a guide, must be mistress and guide, must be the master and guide, meaning you follow your nature, necessarily here, there is a fundamental rejection of the Catholic understanding, and not just Catholic, even in Aristotle, of the smart pagans of antiquity. Aristotle talked about the impeccability. Was that what it was? No, not impeccability, a different word. The peccability. Sorry. He talked about the peccability, meaning this inherent weakness that human beings have where we know we ought to do something good, but instead choose something bad. We give into our lower appetites, even though our reason tells us we shouldn't, initially, until our consciences are completely muddled, and then we end up picking sin with a dead conscience, which is what makes it so difficult for those who have lived for so long in a certain lifestyle to get out of it, except by the miracle of God's grace. In any event, so first is the nature. So if we think that nature itself should be the mistress and guide, then we must be Rousseauians. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was a French philosopher, and he believed, he had this idea of the noble savage. Basically, human beings are perfect. Leave them alone. Stop putting these social constructs. Sound familiar? It's just like leftism today. Stop putting these social constructs on people. Leave them alone, and they will become good. They'll become what they're meant to be because they're fundamentally good. There's nothing wrong with them. It's all this stuff we do to them. It's this religion. It's this education. It's it's all these things. That's what makes people bad. It's our fault for making them believe things. If we just leave them to their own devices, everything's going to work out great. You obviously have to be completely historically ignorant for this. You're going to have to ignore all of pagan society, both ancient and current. Anyway, but these modern philosophies are not for intelligent people, even though they feign to be as such. And then also human reason. So trust your nature and reason above all. Okay, that's a denial of original sin, and it's a denial that man is subject to the commandments of God and the revelation of God primarily. This is a denial of this fundamental fact that although we definitely believe in reason as Catholics, we 100% believe in reason, faith in reason. The First Vatican Council says that we can know God by reason. We don't even need scripture for that. St. Paul tells us that in the first chapter of Romans. The pagans had no excuse, essentially, as he said, because they knew God was creator, but they went for the creature. Okay? We are not without excuse just because we haven't had revelation, because we do have reason. Nonetheless, this idea that reason and faith must be separated, this is a heresy. Before Protestantism, because remember Martin Luther, if you didn't know, he called reason a whore. He did not believe in reason. He believed in faith alone. Not works as well, but also not reason. Long before Martin Luther, there was a movement in Aristotelian philosophy around the time of William of Ockham and St. Thomas Aquinas. They are different centuries, I believe. I think Ockham was in the 1300s. But in that sort of span of 150, 200 years, it's funny. We look back now and it's funny when you're living in a time, 1 year, 2 year, 3 year feels like a long time. We look at history, we have these short time spans, which are really 152 years. So it's a long time, but relative to the purview of history, it's not that long in the grand scheme of things. In any case, there was this movement in religion, which did lead to the Protestant Revolution, which is this idea that pure reason cannot be, or reason itself really cannot be mixed with faith or can't be reconciled with faith. This is against teachings of the church. This was condemned. This was the result of a bad Aristotelianism by men like William of Ockham, for example. This is where we get the heresies of nominalism. What is nominalism? Nominalism is essentially the idea that you can call a thing a name and you don't actually know what the essence of that thing is. So it's completely contrary to Scripture. So when you look at the first book of Genesis, and this is why I defend the literal interpretation of Genesis so much, because although I believe there is mystery there, and I understand that one can hold an ancient earth or a young earth, and as long as we believe the De Fide proclamations about the special creation of Adam and Eve, I understand that that's what is required as Catholics. I'm not anathematizing someone who has a different opinion, but one of the reasons why I defend the literal interpretation so much is because there is so much philosophical and theological significance in that history of Genesis, that sacred history, not just mythological or not just allegorical, etc. There's actual true theological and historical knowledge. And if you look to Genesis, Adam is told by God what? To name the animals. Now, why is that? Well, if you look to Aquinas and you look to the fathers and, the big names who understand these things in the past, they will tell you that Adam, because of his pre-fallen state, and that goes into the error of trusting human nature as mistress and guide today, because we're fallen now, right? We have original sin. We can't trust our nature on its own. We also can't trust our reason on its own. And this is seen in Genesis. So God tells Adam what? He says, you can name the animals. Now, does this mean that Adam sees a cow? Obviously, he wouldn't have been speaking English, but whatever. He sees a cow and he says, oh, when I see things with white and black spots or whatever, I tend to think of the word cow. No. Adam had infused knowledge because of his perfect state that he was created in, as did Eve. He had infused knowledge in an angelic sense, we might say, to use a loose analogy. And therefore, he could look at a thing and he could understand the essence of that thing. So the words and the names that he gave those things corresponded to the essence of those things. So the name was not just some sort of placeholder to describe what it looked like. He gave the perfect name to describe what the thing is. And this is one of the reasons why, as someone, I don't have a background in theology from a scholarly perspective. My background is in studying languages. And that's one of the big red pills for me on evolution, as I would study languages. And as part of my language studies, I also studied linguistic acquisition, language acquisition, and the structures of languages. People that do that sort of to the highest degree, we call those people philologists. That was J.R.R. Tolkien. That's why he could create languages, because he understood languages have an inherent structure. And one of the things you realize when you study languages is that it is impossible for someone to learn to speak a language unless they're taught the language. This is an impossibility. There have been very sad cases where they found certain people, whether they were imprisoned or whatever, or in dungeons and things, these weird things happen. And they'll find someone who's in adolescence who's never learned to talk. And they can never learn to talk properly because there's something about the neural pathways and the faculties of language acquisition which are completely destroyed. They're not destroyed. They're not used in a time where they can, so they can't learn to speak properly. So I knew evolution was impossible from a language perspective because there's no way you could bark and squeak and grunt your way to having a language unless that language was taught. And the only way it could be taught was by someone who could speak. What does God tell us in the scriptures? In the beginning was the Word. Obviously, the word doesn't just mean language, but there's a lot of significance there. We also know God is speaking things into creation. He's infusing the highest creature, which is the highest created thing, the created animal, human thing, which is a person, and he's giving him the gift of language. Okay, so these errors of trusting your reason and trusting your human nature as such, this is a demonic error, and it's a denial of original sin, and it's a denial of the infused knowledge that was given to Adam and Eve and not to us. Okay? This is the original temptation of the devil in the scriptures. When the devil says, eat of this tree and you'll become like gods, meaning you'll become like angelic creatures, you'll become higher than you are, so this is sin of pride. And he says, not so you have the power to, do magic tricks, not so you have the power of a genie in a bottle, not so you can do math problems or something. He says, so you can know good and evil. You'll become like gods with the knowledge of good and evil. Now, does that mean that a God was trying to keep from us the fact that there was morality? No, Adam and Eve, this is why they were guilty of the original sin, is because they knew good and evil. The meaning behind this is you will be above the creation and you will possess the ability to define reality on your own terms. You will be the Lord of what is good and what is evil. You will be a relativist. That's the main error that Pope Benedict talked about. I have my differences with Benedict, especially when he was Cardinal Ratzinger, very liberal ideas he had for many years. He was a lot better later in age. But even Pope Benedict, he said one of the worst problems in our age, the fundamental problem, is that of relativism. And I have to agree with him on that because really that's inherent in this primordial error of the devil and this primordial error of naturalism in Masonry. Let's continue with the next part. He said, so deciding to follow these errors, this decided they either ignore man's duties towards God or pervert them by vague and erroneous opinions. Let's look at the first part. They ignore man's duties towards God. Let's get to the Novus Ordo now. This is kind of a long introduction. Thanks for staying with me. What happened with the Novus Ordo? Well, one, yes, it was created by a Freemason, so that's no shocker. But even if it wasn't, even if someone could prove to me Annibale Bugnini was not a Freemason, we do know that Protestants were consulted, and we do know that the Novus Ordo was acceptable to Protestants because they said as much after the council or after the liturgy was promulgated. That's a problem. Our liturgies should never be acceptable to Protestants as Protestants. A Protestant as an individual may, as their own unique person, they may come to the opinion that the Catholic Mass is true and perfectly presents the Catholic faith, and therefore they convert. But if someone holds to all the doctrines of Calvin or Luther or whatever, Zwingli, etc., Wesley, whoever it is, and they find that the Catholic Mass is acceptable to them as Protestants, this is a big problem. And this is seen, and I have another book here that I've talked about many times. By the way, I'm thinking of starting a podcast for paid subscribers, either on YouTube memberships or Substack, where basically like a book club. I'll just go over all these books because I know people don't always have time to read. Anyway, this is a great book. Let me know in the comments if you think that's a good idea and you want to sign up. This is called St. Edmund Campion, Priest and Martyr by Evelyn Waugh. I've talked about this a lot lately because I read it the last couple of weeks and it really was life-changing. And at the time, the Protestants did not accept the Mass of the Catholics. Look at what Cranmer did to the Mass. You can read Michael Davies' book, an excellent book, Cranmer's Godly Order, about the Anglican destruction of the liturgy, which very much looked like Vatican II and the Novus Ordo Missae, to be honest. In any event, it was clear that the Catholic Mass was not acceptable to Protestants, and that was why they would go around hunting down priests, because they couldn't have this Mass, because they knew that it was the opposite, it was the antithesis of their relativistic faith that is in accord with these Masonic principles we've talked about in this encyclical from Pope Leo XIII. So if a Mass is acceptable to Protestants, that's a big problem. That's not a mark of honor. That's a mark of shame. And we should be ashamed that the Novus Ordo is acceptable to Protestants, because all that is acceptable to Protestants should be revolting to us, because it's a heresy, and we do not want the approval of heretics. Okay, so the Novus Ordo paradigm. Let's go back to this quote here. They ignore man's duties towards God. Look at, and Mass of Ages 3 is coming out. You can go watch the second episode, because it represents this very well, especially with this graphic they did comparing the new Mass and the old Mass. Look at what they did in the new Mass. They stripped out a huge proportion of it, and they changed a significant amount of it. Only about 13% is the same. Only about 13% has remained untouched. That's insane. That's also why we can't call the new Mass the Roman Rite, because it's not the Roman Rite. You can't change something 87%. That's almost 90%. That's almost complete. You can't change something 87% and say it's still the same thing. That's not how it works. Okay? If you have a car and you cut the thing into pieces and all you have left is the steering wheel and the passenger seats, you don't have a car anymore. You can't tell me it's a car just because it has some of the aspects of the old car. It's not. It's a different thing. So right away, we see this spirit of naturalism. They want to deny man's duties towards God, ignore man's duties towards God. This is seen in the new Mass. The old Mass is arduous in the sense that it requires a lot of activity. It requires a lot of discipline. That's all taken out. So that's number one. And the next part is by vague and erroneous opinions. So they either ignore the duties or to God, or they pervert them by vague and erroneous opinions. All of the opinions that were used to justify the Novus Ordo, these are vague. And notice, he doesn't say it must be a false opinion. It must be a vague opinion. So vague is bad. So when they say the Second Vatican Council is not erroneous technically, I think it is in certain parts. Another conversation for another day. When they say it's not erroneous in certain parts, even the proponents of Vatican II will admit there are ambiguities in it. This is not an uncommon admission by the Ratzingerian type crowd. They will admit that there's ambiguities. Pope Leo XIII is saying this is a mark of the naturalist error. When we change or deny or ignore our duties towards God, and our primary duty is what? Our primary duty is to worship God the way that he wills. Okay? Look in the Old Testament. After the flood, even go back further. You go to Cain and Abel. Right after the fall, we go right to the fact that we have Cain and Abel. What are Cain and Abel doing? Cain and Abel are worshiping God. Cain does it in the wrong way, meaning he does it with the wrong intention. Abel does it in the right way, meaning he does it with the right intention. What happens to Abel? He's killed by his brother. Why? Because God accepts one sacrifice and he rejects the other one. He rejects that of Cain, and he accepts that of Abel. Why does Cain kill his brother? Because that proud demonic spirit, which is inherent in naturalism in this encyclical from Leo XIII, and it's in Freemasonry, it's in Judaism, the post-temple sort, and so on and so forth. It's in all of these eras of our day. He rejects God's will, and he wants to do his own version of what is acceptable to him, but not acceptable to God. And when it is pointed out to him by God that this is unacceptable, instead of conforming himself to God's will, he murders his brother. And this is exactly what we've seen since the Second Vatican Council. I won't give any spoilers, But I just saw the Massive Ages documentary number 3. I'll have a review of that on the day that it's released, and I'll do a podcast review of it after it's out. I won't give any spoilers, but nonetheless, part of the film, and this is in the trailer, part of the film is the reaction of traditional Catholics to Traditionis Custodes, which is what? The encyclical, or the motu proprio, excuse me. I believe it's a motu proprio. Don't quote me on that. Maybe it's an apostolic exhortation. Might be a motu proprio. Whatever it is. The document of Pope Francis, where he heavily restricts the old Mass. Okay, why? Because the modernists, following the spirit of Cain, following the spirit of this organized naturalism, this naturalism of the Freemasons, they must reject the old and they must destroy it out of vengeance. This is why the modernist bishops, since the council, all they've done is they have tried to destroy Catholic tradition. Yes, Pope Benedict talked about the hermeneutic of continuity. That failed. That failed. Whatever the good intentions may have been, it failed. It was bound to fail because it was Hegelian. The new Mass is not the Roman Rite. The old Mass is the Roman Rite. Pope Benedict thought through this hermeneutic of continuity that the new Mass could enrich the old Mass, and the old Mass could enrich the new Mass. That's impossible. I mean, it's not impossible that the old Mass, saying the old Mass could help you say the new Mass better. That is what you see when you have these priests who say the old Mass and the new Mass together. Generally speaking, they get much more reverent in saying the new Mass. But it's impossible for the new Mass to enrich the old Mass because the new Mass isn't Catholic and the old Mass is. So you're asking something that's not Catholic to enrich Catholicism, which is impossible. This is the era of ecumenism. And this is why the hermeneutic of continuity, whatever intellectual satisfaction it may have given certain academics, and I'm sure it did, this is why it failed. It was doomed to fail. And with Pope Francis, there is no pretense that the hermeneutic of continuity is around. It died with Pope Benedict, and it's never going to come back because it failed. Now, there may be a conservative pope who's more of a Ratzingerian after Francis, which would be a welcome thing because at least he'd probably be a lot more friendly to tradition. But that fundamental error would still be there, and we're going to be in the same position we are with Francis sometime in the future until the church returns to her tradition. That's just a fact. So what we see with Cain and Abel is that when you have this denial or perversion of your duty towards God, this is rejected by God. So you have two options. One option is you can conform to God's will, or you can kill it. That's what Cain did. The hierarchs of the church, I was going to say the heresiarchs, same thing. The hierarchs of the church since the council, what have they been doing? They have been destroying tradition because they have to, because it is this demonic spirit and Satan wants to destroy you. He wants to destroy your soul. Therefore, those who are inspired by this naturalism, which is inherent in the new Mass, which we're going to continue to talk about here, they must try to destroy the old true thing. Okay? Also, as a side note, Abel represents the new covenant Christ. He's offering a lamb. It's pretty obvious. Cain represents the Jews, and he's offering grain. And it shows that the Jews, the older brother, Cain is the older brother, will kill the younger brother, who is Christ, okay, who is the lamb. But the sacrifice in perpetuity will be offered as the grain. So the Eucharist, the Mass, it's all there. We go to Noah after the flood. The first thing he does, his primary duty towards God is what? Offering sacrifice. He sets up an altar. Same thing with Abraham. After this battle, what does he do? He sets up an altar. He offers the bread and the wine with Melchizedek, who is, as the commentators tell us, actually a son of Noah, and he's the high priest. Christ is the high priest in the line of Melchizedek, offering the bread and wine as the high priest. This is a prefigurement of the Mass, and so on and so forth. In any event, so since the council, what has happened is, in the new Mass, is that man's duties towards God have been ignored. Where are the holy days of obligation? Where is the rigor in the Mass? It's gone. Okay? Even in places where they've tried to maintain it, places like Poland, it's failing. This is why Poland is now being taken over by the Marxists, because a state that adopts the Novus Ordo, even if it's a Catholic state, the Novus Ordo imbibes a non-Catholic spirit over time, especially into the priests that say it, and also into the lay people that attend it, and they cannot help but becoming liberals hence why Poland is becoming a liberal country. Or they pervert them by vague and erroneous opinions. All of the justifications for the new Mass are based on vague and erroneous opinions. What they do is they go quote mining back to the early church, and they find this and that. The famous one is about communion in the hand. They find some, doubtful, singular, unique comment from a church father talking about receiving communion in the hand, and they say, "Look, this is what the early church wanted." But really, this does not correspond to the sacred tradition and the tradition through the church that we see through the theologians over the centuries and centuries. This does not correspond to the Holy Ghost's will as the church has been guided for many, many centuries. And this is an erroneous opinion. So, to continue here, what we see in the promulgation of the new Mass is we see, if we go back to this first idea of trusting reason and human nature, there's also this massive underemphasis. And people will say things like, well, I'll agree that the new Mass is deficient, but I wouldn't say it's evil. No, deficiency is an evil. Deficiency is an evil, okay? Pope Leo XIII, he is talking about this very evil philosophy. He's saying vagueness, ambiguity. He is calling it an evil. It's a document. It's a document about the Freemasons, for goodness sakes. If he's saying this is a thing that's part of Masonry, that thing is an evil. And this is scriptural. Christ says to us, let your yes mean yes and your no mean no. He doesn't say, let your yes mean maybe and your no mean perhaps. He says, yes mean yes, no mean no. He says to us in the Apocalypse, I wish that you were hot or cold, but because you're neither hot nor cold and you're lukewarm, I will vomit you out of my mouth. So if we are not yes or not no, meaning we don't have affirmative clarity, and if we're neither hot nor cold, meaning we're not clear on what we are, then this is revolting to Jesus Christ and we are vomited into hell. That's what it means. The new Mass is ambiguous. The new Mass is neither hot nor cold. It's based on erroneous opinions, and it contains in it an explicit denial of the duties towards God and perverts them. And as I said, the Cains of the church, rather than conforming themselves, they've continually sought to kill Abel, which is why they've tried to kill tradition, because tradition is the manifestation of the Christian spirit from the time of Christ to the apostles through the church. They want to kill that because Cain must always kill Abel out of his pride, just like the Jews must kill Christ. Now, the reason and the nature. Let's talk about the nature for a second. In the new Mass, it is not clear at all. It is not clear at all from a regular person perspective. And if you're an academic and you're a scholar and you like to read a ton of big books, that's great. But please, you do not represent the average person. Catholicism is not a religion for academics. Catholicism is a religion for old ladies who have rosary beads and are wearing veils and pray in front of an icon and a crucifix. That is what Catholicism is for. You do not need to be literate to be a saint. So it drives me nuts. And I have friends who are academics, Dr. Kwasniewski. He's a friend of mine. Man, oh man, that guy's smart. Had a pleasure to meet Professor Mike Cirilla from Steubenville. What a great mind of Catholic tradition he is. And I'm privileged to call these people friends and acquaintances, and I greatly respect these people. But Catholicism is not a religion for academics. It's a religion for regular human beings, okay? You don't have to have a formal education to be a sound Catholic. In fact, many of our Catholic saints are illiterate because the faith, when it's done properly, catechized, preached, and represented, a representation of Calvary, the one and same sacrifice on the altar and on Calvary, the same thing. When that happens, we know the Catholic faith. If you know your rosary, if you know your basic catechism questions, if you know how to pray, if you know how to go to confession, if you know how to, and the monks who were illiterate for so many years didn't even write down the music. Many of the monks were illiterate, but they didn't have to be. They didn't even write down the Gregorian chant. Dr. Kwasniewski talks about this in his book, Good Music, Sacred Music and Silence. These monks literally memorize Gregorian chant without even writing it down. You don't have to be a scholar to be a saint. So even if someone could say, well, Kennedy, I've read 14 books by Jacques Maritain. I've read a bunch of Ratzinger, and I read, some Balthazar, and I'm up on my JP2, blah, 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 blah. And I can find that when they say this is actually a reference to this. I don't care. It's meaningless because religion is not for your PhD. Catholicism is not for PhDs. Catholicism is for regular human beings. So this is why Leo XIII, in this encyclical, in this book by Father Fahey, he's saying vagueness is bad. Ambiguity is bad. Christ tells us that. Ambiguity is bad. Okay. So in the new Mass, it is not clear that there is a sacrifice for sin. This is not clear at all. I don't care who tells you otherwise. Go talk to people who attend the old Mass, the average person, not a scholar, not an academic. Go talk to people who attend the new Mass, do a random poll and say, do you get the impression when you go to Mass? Do you get the impression when you go to Mass? Don't open up some big manual. Just do you get the impression as a regular human being who does not have to be an academic? Do you get the impression that it is an offering for the propitiatory nature? Is it a propitiatory offering for sin? Do you get that impression at the new Mass? Do you get that impression at the old Mass? I guarantee you the vast majority who go to the old Mass are going to say, it's very clear this is a sacrifice for sin. Then if you open your missal, it's obviously clear. But even without opening up your missal, it's clear, it is somber, it is a propitiatory sacrifice, meaning it is an offering for the forgiveness of sins. It's a sacrifice for sins, for the forgiveness of sins. This is not clear. This is not clear at all in the new Mass. If it was clear, the Protestants would not accept it because it is a blasphemy for Protestants because they're heretics. It is a blasphemy for Protestants that you would ever have to offer anything for the forgiveness of sins because it's once saved, always saved. It's Jesus paid the price. He paid a debt that he didn't owe, and it was a price that I couldn't pay, that sort of thing. That's true. But that's why the Mass is the same sacrifice as Calvary. And that's where we fix that problem. That's not clear in the new Mass. Also, let's move on to the reason part. We've denied the human nature because the new Mass it presents a denial of human nature, of the fallen human nature, where we need this continual propitiation for our sins. Clear in the old Mass, not clear in the new Mass. The reason part, here's the thing. Inherent in this idea, this revolutionary idea, when you let your reason, meaning your thoughts, your thinking, be the mistress and guide, what you're saying is you are submitting revelation and tradition to your opinion. That's what that ultimately means. This is why the Protestant revolutionaries, the Protestant heretics, can say, yes, we have the church. Yes, we have scripture, but I understand it differently. So I'm starting my own church and I'm going to start my own liturgy. And I'm going to decide which books should be in the Bible and which books should not be in the Bible. Okay, you see how that works. This is why in Protestantism, they talk about sola fide, sola scriptura, etc., the five solas. But we should add another one. We should call it sola conscience, only conscience. This is why Protestantism is such a mess. It's me and Jesus, if you think it's a sin, that's on you, that's not on me, right? This idea that you can just simply decide for yourself and you can submit the revelation of God, which is what Adam and Eve did. God revealed things to them directly, and they submitted that to their own reasoning and exalted themselves above the commandments of God. When you believe that you can submit divine revelation to your own reason, you now make yourself God, knowing good and evil. You see, just like Adam and Eve. What they did with the new Mass is they said, we have Catholic tradition. Who cares? We need a new Mass for a new people. That's a problem. Hold on a second. Did human nature change? If it didn't change, and it didn't, right? And the Masons would disagree with Catholics about the nature of the human person, which we've talked about. If human nature didn't change, then we can't change the nature of the Mass, because the nature of the Mass is perfectly tailored for the needs of men who must worship God in a certain way for the forgiveness of their sins. So there's that problem. But then they look at Catholic tradition, they say, I'm going to submit Catholic tradition, I'm going to submit apostolic tradition, I'm going to submit the liturgical tradition, the catechetical tradition, etc. of the church. I'm going to submit that to my understanding, and I'm going to do what I think is best over and above what tradition tells me is best. That's where the rubber meets the road with the new Mass. Not only is it vague, not only does it take away the real duties that we have towards God, both liturgically and in our spiritual life, not only does it deny implicitly, if not explicitly, through its presentation, the fallen nature of mankind and how we must have propitiation for our sins, the whole ethos of it is no different than the ethos of the Masons and the Protestants and the Jews ultimately, in that we will reject the long-standing revelation of God, we will reject the sacred tradition, and we will exalt our opinions over the opinions of the saints, fathers, doctors, apostles, and so forth. And in order to justify that, full circle, we're going to have erroneous opinions that are based in either revisionist history or errors about history. This is the new Mass, and it perfectly follows the plan of naturalism condemned by Pope Leo XIII, which was the theology, the philosophy of the Masons. It really is a theology. Now, that's direct reasons. Those are direct consequences. What about indirect? Because obviously there are many people who attend the new Mass who do keep the Catholic faith. This is despite the new Mass, but they do keep the Catholic faith. They're catechizing themselves, they're praying the rosaries, whatever. They're gritting their teeth, they're bearing it. Here's the problem. You can only do that for so long. You can only do that for so long. Why? Well, it's like this. You know, I always say this to people, okay? Would you ever send your kids to public school? Right? You're a conscientious Catholic. You want to homeschool if you can. You want to send them to a good traditional Catholic school if you can. Would you willingly send your kids to public school? You would do everything in your power not to do that. Why? Because you know, no matter what you're teaching them at home, no matter how many rosaries you pray at night, okay, you're submitting your kids to an intellectual system which is anti-Christ. And that's also in this book, by the way. Anyway, you're submitting your kids to an intellectual system that is completely opposed, it's Masonic, completely opposed to the good of their soul. God is not welcome in the curriculum of public schools. And if he is, God is placed on the same level as the false gods of the demon-worshiping religions. This is impossible to accept as a Catholic. We cannot accept this. In fact, in Ontario, the province I live in, you can read these old letters from bishops, 20s, 30s, 40s, long time ago. You would be excommunicated from the diocese you were in if you sent your kids to a Protestant school, because they knew this was putting the kids' eternal salvation in danger, which is a very grave thing to do. A very grave thing. I understand there are situations where we're in impossible situations where there's no option, maybe single parent home, etc. I get that. I'm just saying these are the principles. There are always the messiness of human life. People have to work that out on their own. I'm just saying as a general guide. So I say to people, would you put your kids in a public school? They'd say, heck no. Why? Because they know that they're going to start to believe what is being prayed in the school. I'm using the word prayer loosely. What's being expressed in the school. The church calls this the Lex Credendi, the Lex Credendi. We have the law of prayer. So how we pray will be the law of belief, how we believe. What we do is what we believe. So if we participate in a naturalist, anti-traditional, Masonically inspired liturgy, it is impossible that we will not be affected by this. It's impossible. It's impossible. This would be the error of rejecting the truth about human nature. You would have to reject the fact that human beings imitate their surroundings, which is impossible. This is why you cannot put yourself in a near occasion of sin unless there's a grave reason. So for example, a man can never go to a strip club, but a police officer, if there's a shooting in a strip club, he can run in to try to get the bad guys. But that's a completely different scenario. There's a grave reason to do so. He's not doing so for the prospect of sin. He's doing so, and there's a cause of double effect. It's a different thing entirely. A man could never watch pornography willingly. If a man is a detective and he's trying to catch, some serial abuser, and he has to sadly go through certain films in order to, that's a disgusting, awful thing. That's not the same thing. These are differences. Okay, so we can never put ourselves willingly, without grave reason, into a situation of grave, a near occasion of grave sin. Okay? One more example. We should not be going to places where people are immodestly dressed, intentionally, if we can help it. Society being what it is, nobody wears clothes in the summer, so you can't even leave your house. Well, you've got to leave your house, so that's not an intentional reason to put yourself in grave sin. You're just going to the grocery store. It's not the same thing. But you can't go to a nightclub, if that makes sense. So over time, human beings will start to act like what is being taught them. The same thing will happen in the liturgy. This is why even conservative Catholics, it's 9 times out of 10. Conservative Catholics, meaning big JP2 fans, big Ratzinger fans, they're listening to Catholic Answers, etc. But they attend Father Boomer's Novus Ordo Parish for the last 40 years and look at the retention of their children keeping the faith as they grow up. It's very low compared to traditional Catholic families. This does not mean traditional Catholic families are perfect. It's not about the traditional Catholic family. It's about the traditional liturgy and the traditional faith. So even if the parents have defects, the faith is still presented. Okay? This is why Archbishop Lefebvre, for example, he talked about this in various places, but he talked about how he saw it. He was a missionary in Africa. He saw where they would set up a school where they would train young men in minor seminary and then eventually seminary if they would go on to the priesthood. They would say mass, that people would convert. The village itself would actually transform. They would start with the mass first. The mass changed society. Okay? This is why since the Second Vatican Council, since the promulgation of the new mass, we have seen an ever hastening, a quickening, let's call it, of the destruction of society, because we no longer have this bulwark of this true sacrifice, which is forming the minds, consciences, and hearts of Catholics. We have rejected the kingship of Christ. That's another thing as well, as a secondary effect. Maybe it's primary, but as an effect of the new mass, there is nothing kingly about the new mass. And this was represented by Paul VI. What did he do? He moved the Feast of Christ the King to the last week of the liturgical calendar. Why? Big problem there. Big problem. What was the problem? In the old calendar, the kingship of Christ is not at the end of the liturgical year. It's at the end of October. It's not at the end of the liturgical year. Why? Because Christ is not only the king when he comes back. Christ is the king now. Christ is the king right now. In the new mass, Christ is the king when he returns. This is the new mass thing. So it's a rejection of the kingship of Christ in the liturgical setting. Okay? These are the effects that are the new mass. And that plays right in to the plan of the Freemasons. There is no divinely revealed religion which all men must adhere to. There is no offering for sin because we don't need it, because we deny the truth about human nature. There is no sacred tradition that we are bound to because we hold erroneous opinions. There is no revelation that we must be beholden to because our reason is our guide above revelation. And all of these things take place in the Masonic plan, and they are aided by the Novus Ordo promulgation in this age of Masonry in the church. This is not in this quote, but I'll just go for a few more minutes here before I sign off. One of the sacrosanct virtues, and it's really a heresy, one of the sacrosanct virtues of the new mass paradigm is the idea of religious liberty. And this was condemned many times by the popes. And in fact, this is one of the main motivations for Archbishop Lefebvre's heroic consecrations in 1988, because he submitted a dubia. He followed the plan, he followed the steps, he followed the process. He submitted a dubia to Cardinal Ratzinger, and he got a response anonymously. No one's name was on it, which was that's a demonic thing, because the devil is duplicitous, meaning the devil likes to do things in the shadows, right? The fact that it was given to them anonymously was a problem. And I talk about this in my book, SSBX The Defense. I have a whole chapter on this question of religious liberty and how Archbishop Lefebvre proved that the policy, even if anonymous, coming from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, was in complete contrast, contradiction, and error compared to the traditional teaching of the Church, condemned by so many popes, this error of religious liberty. The Novus Ordo oozes religious liberty. As we said, it's acceptable to Protestants. Major problem. That, I showed you this book earlier, St. Edmund Campion. This man and the English martyrs died for the Catholic Mass. And they died because it was unacceptable to Protestants. We spit on their graves. We dishonor, we sully their reputation. We offend them. We are worthless scumbags as Catholics. If we accept a Mass that is acceptable to Protestants, as this man hanged, drawn, quartered, ripped to pieces on the rack, to the point that it was so bad after he'd gone through months and months of torture that when it came time for him to debate the Anglican clerics, who he still beat even though he was starving and tortured half to death, he still beat them in a debate because he was a bloody genius. He couldn't even raise his hand to make his oath because his ligaments were broken. Imagine being pulled by a machine. Imagine that. Just you're hanging on a chin-up bar. They fasten your hands to the chin-up bar. They fasten your feet to some sort of pulley system. And they stretch you until your arms dislocate, your elbows dislocate, your wrists dislocate, and your ligaments break. They did that to him many, many times. Many times. They cut him and tortured him. He spilled his blood for the Catholic Mass, which was unacceptable to Protestants. So the fact that if you go to an Anglican service, maybe you have a reason to, someone's a friend, getting married or something, and you see that the Anglican service is almost identical to the new Mass, this should cause you complete heartbreak. You should be weeping over Jerusalem when you see that. This is spitting on the grave. This is trampling on the legacy of St. Edmund Campion. We haven't even talked about the martyrs of Canada, the French martyrs of Canada and the northeastern United States. That's not as much about the Mass. It's about something else. But this is why I'm talking about St. Edmund Campion. But these Jesuit martyrs, they literally spilled their blood, and they had their bodies pulled to shreds so you could have your Mass. And they were willing to do that rather than celebrate a Mass that was acceptable to Protestants. Within very short order, the Protestant Revolution became the breeding ground for Freemasonry. And that Masonic spirit is in spades in the new Mass, and we should all reject it for that reason. All right. I've made a lot of friends in this podcast. I'm sure most of you will like it. For those of you who think that I'm some schismatic heretic, I probably won't get a Christmas card from you, but I don't care. All right, ladies and gentlemen, as always, this has been the Kennedy Report. Until next time, God bless.